I swear that I'll never be this person again. But if I don't fight now, innocent people will die.
On a seemingly ordinary Tuesday night, the high-stakes world of billionaire Julian Croft was meant to end. 5 professional assassins, swift, silent, and utterly ruthless, stormed the exclusive Gilded Spoon. They were ready for bodyguards and alarms. What they were not ready for was the quiet, unassuming waitress clearing plates in the corner, Aara Vance. To them, she was invisible, just a servant. They were about to learn a costly lesson in respect and survival. This is the story of how a man who controlled empires was saved by the one person no one ever saw coming. It's a story of hidden resilience, of forgotten courage, and how one woman's past, a past of duty and specialized skill, thought long buried, violently resurfaced to alter the balance of power in New York City. The true battle wasn't for Julian Croft's life, but for the moral soul of the city, all decided in 12 terrifying minutes. The Gilded Spoon wasn't a haven for the nouveau riche, those who flaunted their fortunes on social media. It was a relic, a sanctuary of old-world discretion, tucked away on a quiet street in the Upper East Side. Its clientele were individuals whose names were whispered, not shouted. Names etched onto the brass plaques of prestigious university libraries and hospital wings, the kind of power that operated behind closed doors and hushed conversations. On this particular Tuesday, the rain outside painted shimmering, distorted reflections of the city onto the restaurant's leaded glass windows. Inside, the atmosphere was one of subdued elegance. Low, warm light danced off polished silverware and crystal glasses. The air carried the scent of aged leather, roasted duck, and money so ancient it had long forgotten how to be ostentatious. And moving through this meticulously cultivated tranquility was Vance, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. To the casual observer, Aara was unremarkable, and that was precisely her design. At 27, she had perfected the art of invisibility. Her movements were economical and silent, her expression placid and neutral. She anticipated the needs of patrons with an almost preternatural intuition, refilling water glasses before they were empty, clearing plates the instant a fork was laid down, and presenting the check precisely when it was desired. By all accounts, she was an exemplary waitress. But beneath that serene exterior, Aara was a fortress of observation. She didn't merely see the patrons, she catalogued them. The man in booth 4, Mr. Abernathy, always fidgeted with his wedding ring when deceiving his dinner companion. The couple by the window, the Sinclairs, were on the precipice of a bitter divorce, betrayed by the subtle millimeter of space they maintained between their wine glasses. Aara noted everything, the slightest shift in posture, the tightening of a jaw, the almost imperceptible flicker of an eye. This wasn't a skill learned in hospitality school, but forged in the crucible of a past she kept securely locked away, buried beneath practiced smiles and polite nods. Around her neck, hidden beneath her uniform, she wore a simple, worn silver locket on a thin chain. Smooth from years of anxious fidgeting, it was the sole remaining vestige of her former life that she permitted herself to keep. At precisely 8:15 p.m., the bell above the heavy oak door chimed softly. Julian Croft entered, and a subtle shift occurred in the room's gravitational pull. Heads turned, conversations paused, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Croft wasn't merely wealthy. He was the embodiment of power. As CEO of Croft Enterprises, a sprawling global conglomerate with its fingers in everything from aerospace engineering to private military logistics, He was a man who could move markets with a single phone call. Tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, he possessed a weariness in his sharp blue eyes that even his immense fortune couldn't quite conceal. He was unaccompanied by a security detail, a fact that consistently surprised the staff. He came alone, always on the second Tuesday of each month. He didn't come for the exquisite food or the flawless service. He came for the memory. "Your usual table, Mr. Croft," Antoine, the maitre d', a man with the bearing of a retired diplomat, said with a respectful nod. Aara watched as Croft was led to booth 7, a secluded alcove in the rear of the restaurant. It had been his late wife's favorite spot. Aara knew this not from being told, but from observing the way his gaze would occasionally drift to the empty chair opposite him, a flicker of profound loss, briefly disrupting his otherwise guarded expression. She approached his table, notepad in hand. "Good evening, Mr. Croft. Can I get you something to start with?" He didn't look up from the menu, though he already knew his order. "A glass of the Macallan 25. Neat." His voice, a low baritone, was accustomed to command. "Of course," Aara replied, her voice a soft, professional murmur. As she turned to leave, he spoke again, his tone softer this time. "And Miss Vance—" Aara paused, turning back. It was unusual for him to use her name. He finally raised his eyes to meet hers. They were piercing, analytical, as if he were assessing a hostile corporate takeover. "Is the cocoa van as good as it was last month?" It was a simple question, but it was a test. It was his way of inquiring about the chef's consistency, whether standards were being maintained, whether the meticulously ordered world he sought to control was still holding its shape. "Chef Dubois is in fine form tonight, sir," she replied calmly. "I believe you'll find it exceeds expectations." A flicker of something. Approval, perhaps even a hint of a smile, crossed his lips before vanishing. "Very well." Aara retreated towards the bar, her senses heightened. Something felt different tonight. It wasn't Croft. He was the constant. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a low hum of dissonance just beneath the surface of the restaurant's calm. She dismissed it as a byproduct of the storm outside, the city's perpetual tension seeping through the walls. She was wrong. At the bar, as she retrieved the exorbitantly priced scotch, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror behind the rows of glittering bottles. The face that stared back was a stranger's mask, plain, unassuming, easily forgotten. No one would ever guess the violence her hands were capable of. No one could see the memories that flickered behind her calm, gray eyes. Memories of a life where observation wasn't a job skill, but a matter of survival. The silver locket felt suddenly cold against her skin. It was a reminder of a promise she had made to herself, a vow sealed in blood and tears a lifetime ago. She would never again be a victim. She would always be the one who saw the storm coming. But even she couldn't foresee the hurricane that was about to breach the door. At 8:43 p.m., the chiming of the front doorbell sounded different. Not the gentle announcement of a new patron, but a sharp, discordant clang, as if the door had been forced open rather than gracefully unlatched. 5 men entered, not simultaneously, but in a staggered, coordinated sequence that was almost balletic in its precision. The first 2 were unremarkable, dressed in dark, well-tailored suits that were just a touch too functional for a place like the Gilded Spoon. They bypassed the maitre d' station without a word, one taking up a position with a clear view of the entrance, the other moving smoothly towards the hallway leading to the restrooms, his eyes systematically scanning the dining room. Antoine, the maitre d', opened his mouth to protest this breach of protocol, but a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of the head from the first man silenced him. This wasn't a request. It was an occupation. The next two men were larger, their broad shoulders straining the fabric of their jackets. Beneath, Aara could see the unmistakable bulge of body armor and the subtle yet undeniable outline of holstered weapons at their waists. They moved with the heavy, deliberate confidence of men intimately familiar with violence. One stood near the bar, his back to the wall, his gaze methodically sweeping the room. The other took up a position near the kitchen doors, effectively cutting off the staff's primary escape route. The patrons began to notice. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations faltered. The warm, convivial atmosphere of the restaurant vanished in seconds, replaced by a cold, prickling fear. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken menace. Aara was behind the bar, polishing a wine glass. Her hands continued their rhythmic motion, the soft squeak of the cloth on crystal. The only semblance of normalcy in a room that had fallen deathly silent. But her mind was racing, processing the scene with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were loud, chaotic, and focused on the cash register. These men were silent, organized, and their focus was singular. Her eyes flicked from man to man, noting their positions, their postures, their earpieces. They were establishing a perimeter, a kill zone, and at its center was Booth 7. The fifth man entered. He was clearly the leader, of average height, with dark, slicked-back hair and the sharp, predatory features of a hawk. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that likely cost more than Aara earned in 3 months. He moved with a languid, almost arrogant grace, his eyes fixing on Julian Croft's table with chilling intensity. He offered a thin, cruel smile that didn't reach his cold, dark eyes. This was Marco Bellini, known in the circles that employed him as the Ghost, a specialist in extractions and corporate persuasion of the most brutal kind. Aara's blood ran cold. She recognized the formation. A classic box and seal tactic designed for maximum control and intimidation. She had seen it diagrammed in worn-out training manuals from a past life she fought daily to forget. Her hand instinctively went to the locket beneath her shirt, the cool metal a familiar anchor in a rising tide of adrenaline. Marco glided towards Booth 7, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. The two larger men began to move in concert, flanking him, their purpose now terrifyingly clear. Julian Croft had been observing the unfolding scene in the reflection of his Scotch glass. When Marco reached his table, Croft didn't appear surprised, only mildly annoyed, as if a business meeting had been inconveniently interrupted. He took a slow sip of his drink, before finally raising his eyes. "Bellini," Croft said, his voice laced with contempt. "I should have known Thorne would send a dog with a fancy collar. I assume you're not here to discuss the quality of the cocoa van." Marco's smile widened. "Mr. Croft, always a pleasure. But my employer, Mr. Thorne, feels our last conversation was left unfinished. He's requested a more personal debriefing." He gestured vaguely towards the room, and he asked me to ensure you were fully focused on the discussion. No distractions. At that, one of the larger men produced a compact, suppressed pistol from his jacket. It wasn't aimed at anyone in particular, but its presence was a scream in the silent room. A woman at a nearby table gasped, a choked, terrified sound. Phones began appearing on tablecloths. The man at the bar issued a low growl that cut through the fear. Slowly, shakily, patrons began placing their cell phones onto their white tablecloths. Aara's mind was a supercomputer, running thousands of calculations per second. Kitchen door blocked, main entrance controlled, 2 heavy enforcers, 2 scouts, 1 leader. Target, Croft. Objective, extraction, not assassination. Otherwise, Croft would already be dead. She saw the man by the kitchen doors glance towards her, his eyes dismissive. She was part of the scenery, a waitress, a non-threat. It was the same mistake people had always made about her, the mistake she consistently relied upon. Marco leaned closer to Croft, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We can do this the easy way, Julian, or the hard way. The hard way involves me redecorating this lovely establishment with the blood of these innocent people. The choice, as they say, is yours. You'll come with us, and you'll bring the Phoenix Drive." Croft's composure finally fractured. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face at the mention of the Phoenix Drive. It was a small, almost imperceptible reaction, but Aara saw it, and Marco saw it. "Ah," Marco purred. "So you do have it on you. Excellent. That will save us so much time and unpleasantness." He snapped his fingers. The two large men moved to seize Croft. This was the moment, the point of no return. Aara set the wineglass down on the bar with a soft, deliberate click. The sound was insignificant, yet in the crushing silence, it was everything. The man at the bar turned his head towards the sound, his brow furrowed in annoyance. In that split second of distraction, Aara Vance ceased to be a waitress. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood something else entirely, something forged in pain, honed by discipline, and utterly, terrifyingly capable. Her entire posture shifted. The subservient slump in her shoulders straightened into a line of coiled steel. Her placid expression became a mask of cold, lethal focus. Her world narrowed to threats, angles, and opportunities. The storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was in the room, and she was its epicenter. The first move was a symphony of brutal efficiency. It wasn't an act of panic, but a cold, calculated equation of violence. The enforcer at the bar, the one who had turned at the sound of the clicking glass, was the nearest threat, and the one with the clearest line of sight to the most patrons. He had to be neutralized first. Aara moved with a speed that defied belief. One moment she was behind the bar. The next, she was flowing over it, a blur of black and white. She didn't vault it with athletic grace. She used it as a launching point. In her right hand, she now held a heavy, full bottle of bourbon. She hadn't consciously grabbed it. Her body had simply identified it as the best available tool. The enforcer, whose name was Dimitri, had only a moment to register the impossible sight of the waitress hurtling towards him through the air. His hand was already moving for his weapon, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Aara's feet hit the floor, and she pivoted, all her momentum and body weight flowing into the arc of her swing. The bottle connected with the side of Dimitri's head with a sickening, wet thump. It didn't shatter. The force of the impact was absorbed entirely by his skull. His eyes rolled back, and the 250-pound man collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut, slumping to the floor in a boneless heap. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. A collective gasp went through the restaurant, a sound of sheer, unadulterated shock. Marco Bellini, who was in the process of hauling a stunned Julian Croft to his feet, froze. His perfectly orchestrated operation had just been derailed by the help. "What the hell?" The second heavy enforcer, a man named Carlos, positioned near the kitchen, barked, turning his attention and his weapon towards Aara. This was the opening she had created. Aara didn't wait. She kicked one of the heavy bar stools, sending it skittering across the polished floor directly into Carlos's path. He instinctively sidestepped to avoid it, a micro-correction that cost him a precious half-second and shifted his balance. It was all she needed. She lunged forward, staying low beneath the likely trajectory of his aim. She wasn't closing the distance to fight him. She was closing it to reach the kitchen. She slammed through the swinging double doors just as the first gunshot erupted. Crack! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. A woman screamed. The bullet intended for Aara splintered the wooden doorframe where her head had been a moment before. Inside the stainless steel sanctuary of the kitchen, the staff, a chef, 2 sous chefs, and a dishwasher, were huddled in a corner, eyes wide with terror. "Back door now!" Aara's voice was no longer the soft murmur of a waitress. It was a clipped, hard command that brooked no argument. They scrambled to obey, fumbling with the lock on the heavy steel door that led to the back alley. Carlos, the enforcer, kicked the swinging doors open, his pistol held in a 2-handed grip. "Crazy bitch is dead." Aara was already moving. On a prep counter was a cast-iron skillet, still hot from searing scallops. She grabbed it by the handle, the heat barely registering through her adrenaline-numbed senses, and threw it like a discus. Carlos, focused on scanning for a target, didn't anticipate a projectile from his left. The heavy skillet clipped him on the shoulder and wrist of his gun hand. He grunted in pain, his aim wavering as his wrist screamed in protest. That was her second window. As he fought to regain his composure, Aara lunged. She didn't attack his gun, she attacked his body. She drove her shoulder hard into his sternum, using his size against him, forcing him off balance. Her left hand shot out and clamped onto his gun wrist, not to disarm him, but to control the weapon's direction, pointing it towards the ceiling. Her right hand balled into a tight fist, delivering 3 rapid, brutal strikes to his throat. He gagged, his eyes bulging as the air was driven from his lungs. His grip on the gun loosened. Aara twisted his wrist in a sharp, practiced motion that would have broken it had she applied a fraction more pressure. The gun clattered to the tiled floor. She didn't stop. She hooked her leg behind his, sweeping him backwards. He fell hard, his head connecting with the corner of a steel prep table with a sickening crack. He went limp. 2 down. Silence. The only sounds were the panicked breathing of the remaining staff as they finally got the back door open and spilled out into the rainy alley and the distant, terrified whimpers from the dining room. Aara stood for a single second in the center of the kitchen, breathing hard. Her heart was a jackhammer against her ribs. The locket on her chest felt white-hot. This was the part of herself she had tried to kill, the discipline, the violence, the cold, clear-headed focus in the midst of chaos. It was the legacy of her trainer, a man named Sergeant Kalen, who had beaten a single lesson into her until it was part of her DNA. Hesitation is death. Act, react, control. She scooped the fallen pistol from the floor. Her hands knew the feel of it instantly. A Glock 19. She checked the magazine. Nearly full. Her movements were fluid, ingrained, a muscle memory she hadn't accessed in 5 long years. Back in the dining room, Marco Bellini's frustration had curdled into white-hot fury. He shoved Julian Croft back into the booth. "Stay," he snarled, as if speaking to a dog. The 2 remaining scouts, whose names were Anton and Luca, had drawn their weapons and were now cautiously advancing on the kitchen doors, their movements jerky and uncertain. They were scouts, observers, not frontline brawlers. They were out of their depth. "What is she?" Anton whispered, his eyes wide. "Doesn't matter," Marco hissed into his earpiece. "Subdue her now. Use of force is authorized. I want her on the floor." Aara heard the whisper of their shoes on the carpet outside the kitchen doors. She knew they would expect her to come out firing, so she did the opposite. On the stove, a pot of water was at a rolling boil. She grabbed it with a dish towel, moved to the side of the door, and waited. She slowed her breathing, listening. 1, 2 heartbeats. She kicked the door open with her foot and simultaneously hurled the pot of boiling water in a wide, sweeping arc. A scream of agony tore through the restaurant as the scalding water hit Luca full in the face and chest. He dropped his gun, clawing at his skin, his professional demeanor incinerated by pure, unadulterated pain. Anton, splashed by the water but not directly hit, flinched back in shock. Aara exploded from the doorway. She ignored the screaming man and drove straight for Anton. The Glock was held low and tight to her body. He tried to bring his weapon to bear, but she was already inside his guard. She slammed the heavy base of the pistol's grip upwards into his chin. His head snapped back, teeth clicking together, and his world went black. He crumpled to the floor. 3 and 4 down. Now, it was just Marco. Aara pivoted the gun, leveled her stance. Perfect, her hands steady. She and Marco Bellini stood 20 feet apart, separated by a sea of overturned tables and terrified patrons huddled on the floor. Julian Croft watched from his booth, his face a mask of disbelief. Marco had his own weapon out, aimed directly at Croft's head. A stalemate. "Drop it," Marco said, his voice dangerously calm. The fury in his eyes had banked down to a cold, simmering coal. "Drop it now or the billionaire gets a third eye." Aara's gaze was unyielding. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You walk out that door right now. You leave, and you live," she said, her voice steady, devoid of fear. Marco laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. You think you're some kind of hero? You're a waitress. I am Marco Bellini. I have toppled governments for men like him." He gestured with his gun towards Croft. "I don't care if your name is Caesar." "You brought your war into my house," Aara replied, her voice dropping to an icy whisper. "You threatened my guests, and I am asking you politely, one last time, to leave." For the first time, Marco saw her. He truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the servant. He saw the set of her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the professional way she held her weapon. He saw a predator looking back at him. And in that moment, a sliver of doubt, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, lodged itself in his heart. Who was this woman? The stalemate stretched thin and brittle as glass. The air in the Gilded Spoon was thick with the scent of cordite, fear, and expensive perfume. Patrons were frozen, trapped between 2 armed professionals, their world of quiet luxury shattered. Marco Bellini held his gun steady on Julian Croft, but his eyes were locked on Aara. His mind, trained in threat assessment, was struggling to categorize her. She wasn't law enforcement. Her movements were too raw, too efficient, lacking the procedural stiffness. She wasn't military. Her focus was on disabling, not killing. She was something else, something he hadn't encountered. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Waitress," Marco said, his voice a low sneer. He was trying to reclaim control of the narrative, to re-establish his dominance. "Mr. Thorne pays very well for success, but he pays even better for loyalty. My men will be compensated for their inconvenience." Aara didn't flinch. Her eyes darted for a fraction of a second, not away from him, but past him to the large, ornate mirror on the wall behind the bar. It gave her a distorted but crucial view of the main entrance. No sirens yet, no flashing lights. Someone must have called 911, but in the gridlocked chaos of a rainy Manhattan night, response time was... Aara couldn't rely on anything being predictable. It was just her against them. "This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt," she stated calmly, her tone unwavering. It wasn't a plea, but a factual observation, an olive branch he was too proud to accept. Croft, who had been observing the exchange with a mixture of fear and utter disbelief, slowly began to rise from the booth. He was used to being the dominant force in any room, and his instincts were screaming at him to intervene. "Stay down!" Aara and Marco shouted simultaneously, their heads snapping towards Croft. This shared moment of distraction shifted the momentum. It was the opening Marco had been waiting for. He wouldn't simply shoot Croft. That would be a mission failure. His mission was to extract Croft and the drive. Therefore, instead of shooting the billionaire, he fired a shot into the floor just in front of the booth. Bang! The shot echoed thunderously, a jarring blast shattering the stillness. Wood splinters erupted from the antique floor. Croft recoiled violently, falling back into the plush velvet cushions. The shot had served its purpose, a diversion, a sensory overload. As Aara's eyes instinctively flickered towards the sound and movement, Marco made his move. He didn't run. He dove sideways behind a large, overturned oak table, using it for cover. He was a professional, understanding the importance of solid concealment. "You're good," he called out, his voice slightly muffled by the wood. "I'll grant you that. But you're one person. I have all the time in the world." Aara's mind raced. He was right. In a prolonged standoff, she was at a disadvantage. She needed to end this quickly. She began to move, not towards him, but away, using the line of booths as cover, circling towards the restaurant's main floor. The ensuing chase became a deadly game of cat and mouse amidst the wreckage of a fine dining establishment. "Who trained you?" Marco called out, his voice probing, attempting to gauge her background. "Mossad." She didn't respond verbally, unwilling to risk revealing her position through her voice. She moved silently and swiftly, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. She passed a table where a terrified couple huddled together. The man shielded the woman with his body. Aara met his eyes for a brief moment, her gaze conveying not an apology, but a silent, unwavering assurance. "Stay down. I'll handle this." She reached the maitre d' station near the entrance. A heavy, solid bronze swan statue, a decorative piece weighing at least 20 pounds, sat atop the station. A desperate, dangerous idea began to form in her mind. Meanwhile, Marco's patience was wearing thin. He couldn't see her, and this invisibility unnerved him. He briefly peeked from behind his table. Nothing. He dropped back down. Just as he was about to reposition, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Not from the booths, but from the front window. It was a reflection. For a fatal second, he saw Aara's silhouette in the rain-streaked glass near the restaurant's entrance. He reacted instantly, rising and firing 2 quick shots in that direction. Crack! Crack! The window shattered, imploding in a spray of glass and rain. A rush of wind and city noise filled the restaurant, but Aara wasn't there. He'd seen her drape her black server jacket over the bronze swan statue, using it to create a deceptive reflection, a classic misdirection tactic. While he fired at the phantom, she sprinted low and fast, directly towards his position from the side. Marco realized his mistake the instant the shots left his gun. He spun around, attempting to engage his new target, but she was already upon him. She collided with him with the force of a linebacker. They tumbled to the ground in a chaotic tangle of limbs, Marco's gun flying from his hand and skittering across the floor. The ensuing struggle was raw and primal. No guns, only skill and sheer determination. Marco was strong, his physique honed by years of rigorous training. He rolled, attempting to gain a superior position to leverage his weight advantage. But Aara was a whirlwind of controlled aggression. She wasn't aiming to overpower him. She was systematically dismantling him. A sharp elbow strike landed squarely on his floating ribs. He gasped, the air knocked from his lungs as the heel of her hand connected with the bridge of his nose. He felt a sickening crunch, his eyes watering with pain. He swung a wild, powerful punch, aiming for her head, She ducked beneath it, and as his arm swept past, she locked it in a brutal joint lock, applying agonizing pressure to his elbow. Marco let out a raw, animalistic cry of pain, a stark contrast to his earlier composure. This pain transcended training and discipline. The drive. "Where is the drive?" he gurgled, blood flowing from his broken nose filling his mouth. Even in agony, his focus remained on his mission. Aara ignored him, increasing the pressure on his arm, her face a mask of cold fury. This was for the terrified patrons. This was for the sanctity of a place she had considered a refuge for 5 years. This was for the promise she'd made at her brother's grave. With a final sickening pop, she dislocated his elbow. Marco's scream died in his throat, replaced by a choked sob of pain. He collapsed, the fight drained from him. He was broken. Aara stood, breathing heavily. She looked down at the man who had brought chaos into her world. His face a mess of blood and tears, his expensive suit ruined. She felt no pity, only a grim, weary satisfaction. She scanned the room. The remaining 4 men were down, unconscious or incapacitated. The patrons remained huddled, watching her with a mixture of fear and awe. And in booth 7, Julian Croft was slowly rising, his face pale, his blue eyes fixed on her with an unreadable expression. The fight was over, the violence ended, but for Aara Vance, the true battle was just beginning. As she looked from the defeated Marco to the bewildered billionaire, a name echoed in her memory, a name Marco had spoken that changed everything. Mr. Thorne. Her blood ran cold, colder than at any point during the fight. Robert Thorne. She knew that name, and the knowledge of who he was and what he represented sent a tremor of shock through her, more debilitating than any punch or bullet. The immediate aftermath was a surreal scene. The sounds of the city, distant sirens now rapidly approaching, poured in through the shattered window, mingling with the soft sobs of some patrons and Marco Bellini's ragged, pained breathing. Aara stood in the center of the chaos she had created, the Glock held loosely in her hand, no longer aimed at anything. Her adrenaline was fading, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and the familiar metallic taste of violence in her mouth. Her knuckles were raw, a deep bruise already forming on her cheek where one of Marco's wild swings had grazed her, but she felt none of it. All she could feel was the seismic shock of that name, Robert Thorne. Her mind, moments before a marvel of tactical clarity, was now a maelstrom of conflicting memories. She saw a dusty, underfunded community center in a rough part of Brooklyn. She saw a group of scared, angry kids, herself among them, lost after the senseless death of her older brother David, stabbed over a $20 debt. And she saw a kind, soft-spoken man with graying temples and gentle eyes who had appeared one day like an angel. Robert Thorne. He wasn't just a benefactor, he was a savior. He had used his own money to renovate the center, build a new boxing gym, and hire counselors. He had personally funded the self-defense program taught by the grizzled Sergeant Kalin, a former Special Forces operative Thorne had hired. Thorne had seen the raw, unfocused rage in 16-year-old Aara and steered her towards Kalin's class. "Discipline, Aara," he had once told her kindly. "It turns anger into strength. It gives you control." He had given her an outlet, a future. The skills that had just saved a billionaire's life, the skills that defined the most secret, most powerful part of her, were a direct gift from the man who had sent these killers. The world tilted on its axis. She had just protected Julian Croft, a man whose name she only knew from business pages, from the consequences of a war with Robert Thorne, the man who had, in many ways, saved her own life. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs more effectively than any punch. "Miss Vance." Julian Croft's voice broke through her reverie. He had moved from his booth and was standing a few feet away, his suit immaculate except for a dusting of plaster from a stray bullet. His face was a complex mask of shock, gratitude, and intense curiosity. He was looking at her not as a waitress, but as a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. "Are you all right?" he asked. Aara could only nod. Her throat was too tight to speak. She looked at the groaning man on the floor. Marco Bellini. The ghost. He was Thorne's man. He worked for the man who had taught her never to be a victim, and she had just crippled him to protect. Who exactly? "He said they wanted the Phoenix Drive," Croft stated, his voice low and urgent, his eyes scanning the room to ensure no one was close enough to overhear. "How could he know about that?" Aara finally found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. "What is it?" "It's—" Croft hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her. "It's a contingency plan. Data insurance." He was being evasive, the natural behavior of a man like him. Marco, lying on the floor, cradling his ruined arm, let out a pained, wheezing laugh. "Insurance. He calls it insurance. Thorne calls it theft. The intellectual property of a project that could have changed the world before this vulture gutted his company and stole it for himself." He glared at Croft. Aara's eyes snapped back to Croft, a silent question burning in them. Croft's jaw tightened. "Thorne's project was reckless, unstable. It would have destabilized the entire global financial market. I didn't steal it. I contained it. I did what was necessary to prevent a catastrophe." "You did what was necessary to maintain your monopoly," Marco snarled. "You ruined him, a good man. You left him with nothing." Every word from Marco was a hammer blow to the foundation of Aara's world. A good man. She knew Robert Thorne was a good man. She was living proof of his goodness. He had taken nothing from her. He had given her everything. And this man, this Julian Croft, had destroyed him. She was protecting the villain in her own savior's story. The silver locket beneath her shirt suddenly felt impossibly heavy, like a millstone around her neck. It contained a tiny folded picture of her and her brother David, taken a week before he died. Thorne's community center was supposed to be his legacy. Everything she had learned, every hardship she had overcome, was in service of honoring that memory and repaying Thorne's kindness. And what had she just done? Her grip on the Glock loosened. The weight of it was suddenly unbearable. What was she defending? An insurance drive for a corporate predator. Croft saw the shift in her eyes. The doubt, the conflict, the sudden, dangerous wavering of her allegiance. He was a master at reading people, and he knew he was losing her. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice softening, becoming more personal, more urgent. "I don't know what that man Thorne was to you, but I can tell you this. The world is not a simple place of good men and bad men. It's a complex machine. Thorne wanted to burn it down to build his utopia. I am trying to keep it running." The approaching sirens were louder now, a wailing crescendo just a block or two away. The window of opportunity was closing. Marco, seeing the same conflict in Aara's face, tried to press his advantage. "He's lying!" he coughed, attempting to push himself up with his good arm. "Thorne, he wanted to level the playing field. Give power back to people like you. Croft can't stand that. He needs his boot on the world's neck." Aara looked from the bleeding messenger to the powerful tycoon. Both men were trying to claim the moral high ground from a valley of violence and greed. She was caught in the middle, the fulcrum of their war. Her past and present had just collided with the force of a car crash, and she was standing in the wreckage, holding a gun, with no idea which way to turn. The police would be here any second. They would see a waitress with a gun and a room full of bodies. They would see a billionaire witness. The story would be written for her. But in this moment, before the flashing lights painted the walls red and blue, the choice was still hers. Who was she? The loyal beneficiary of Robert Thorne's charity, or the protector of the man he called his destroyer? Her hidden skill had changed everything. But now, a hidden truth threatened to undo it all. The wail of the sirens was almost upon them, the rhythmic pulse of the sound painting the shattered front window in flashes of red and blue. In a few seconds, the room would be flooded with uniforms, questions, and consequences. This fleeting moment was the last echo of Aara's autonomy before the official world imposed its narrative. Julian Croft saw the indecision warring in her eyes and made a final, desperate appeal. It wasn't a threat or a command, but a calculated plea to the woman he had just witnessed. "Miss Vance," he said, using her first name, a deliberate act of intimacy. "Whatever you believe about me or about Thorne, look around this room. These people," he gestured to the terrified patrons, "they don't care about the Phoenix Drive or corporate espionage. They were in the crossfire of a war they knew nothing about. You didn't save me. You saved them." His words struck a chord. Her gaze drifted from his face to the couple she had passed, who were now helping an elderly woman to her feet. She saw Antoine, the maitre d', quietly reassuring his staff. Croft was right. Her actions, born from a personal vow, had created a shield for everyone in the restaurant. Her loyalty wasn't to Croft, or to the memory of Thorne. It was to the innocent. It was to the promise that no one in her presence would ever be a helpless victim again. The conflict in her eyes didn't vanish, but it sharpened into a new kind of resolve. It was no longer about choosing a side. It was about ending the conflict. She took 3 purposeful steps and stood over Marco Bellini. He flinched as her shadow fell over him. She crouched down, not with sympathy, but with an unnerving calm. "The drive," she said, her voice a low command. "Mr. Croft won't be leaving with you tonight, but your employer still wants his property, so you're going to give me a message for him." Marco stared at her, confused and wary. Croft watched his expression, a mixture of apprehension and fascination. What was she doing? What message? "You tell Robert Thorne that the Phoenix Drive is now in the hands of a third party," Aara said, her voice cold and clear. "It is secure. It is no longer in play. If he or anyone else ever makes a move against Mr. Croft or anyone in this room again, the contents of the drive will be released to every major news agency and financial regulator on the planet." Croft's eyes widened. She was bluffing. She didn't have the drive. Marco, however, didn't know that. He saw the conviction in her eyes. "You don't have it," he challenged weakly. Aara leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "Your men are alive, battered and broken. But alive. I could have killed every single one of you. I chose not to. Do I seem like a person who bluffs?" "You tell him David's sister has it," she continued. "He'll know what that means." The mention of her brother's name unlocked a new level of understanding for Marco. This wasn't random. This was personal. A ghost from Thorne's benevolent past had just become his greatest liability. He simply nodded, the fight truly and finally gone from him. Aara stood up and turned to face Croft. She held out the Glock, grip first. "I believe this is yours," she said, her tone professional, as if she were handing him a lost coat. Croft stared at the gun, then back at her face. He understood instantly what she had done. She hadn't chosen him. She had chosen neutrality. She had created a stalemate, mutually assured destruction that protected him far better than any bodyguard could, and in doing so, she had seized control of the entire situation. She now held the leverage over both him and Thorne. He didn't take the gun. The sounds of heavy boots were on the pavement outside. "The police will need to take that," he said quietly. "They'll have questions, a lot of them. Let my lawyers handle it. Don't say a word until they arrive." "I can handle my own questions," she replied, a hint of steel in her voice. He managed a small, wry smile. "Of course you can." He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Aara tensed, but he wasn't reaching for a weapon. He pulled out a small, almost invisible object from a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his suit. It was a minuscule data drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, shaped like a gold feather. The Phoenix drive. Without a word, he pressed it into her hand. Aara's fingers closed around it, the warmth of his hand, the cold, hard reality of the object. It was an act of absolute, insane trust, or perhaps the most calculated business decision of his life. He was placing his insurance in the hands of the only person who had proven she could defend it. He was moving his queen to the safest, most unpredictable square on the board. "You called it a third party," he said, his voice barely a whisper, as the first police officers burst through the door, weapons drawn. "Now you are one." The police swarmed in, a tide of blue uniforms and shouted commands. "NYPD! Drop the weapon! Hands in the air!" Slowly, deliberately, Aara placed the Glock on a nearby table. She raised her empty hands, her right fist tightly clenched around the tiny drive that had caused all this chaos. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She was no longer just Aara Vance, the waitress. She was no longer just the ghost of Sergeant Kalen's training room. She was something new, forged in the crucible of that night. As the police secured the scene, placing the groaning henchman in cuffs and calling for medics, a detective approached her and Croft. Croft immediately took charge, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, weaving a narrative of a robbery gone wrong, of a brave waitress who had defended herself and others. He was protecting her, spinning a story that would keep her out of a prison cell. But Aara knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was a new beginning. She had stepped out of the shadows, and in doing so, had placed herself at the center of a war between two powerful, ruthless men, one of whom had saved her life, the other whose life she had just saved. And in her hand, she held the weapon that could destroy them both. The choice was no longer about who to fight for, but what to build from the ashes. The days that followed were a carefully managed whirlwind. Julian Croft's legal team descended like a tactical unit, sanitizing the chaos at the Gilded Spoon into a palatable, heroic narrative for the police and the press. The official story was a thwarted robbery, and Aara Vance was the brave waitress with a surprising knack for self-defense. The truth was buried under a mountain of paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. A week later, Aara stood not in a police station, but in Julian Croft's office, a glass cage at the apex of the city. He was waiting by the window, a silhouette against the sprawling metropolis. "I owe you a debt that can't be repaid with money," he began, turning to face her. "Though you'll find a sum has been transferred to a private account that will ensure you have the freedom to do whatever you wish with your life." He paused, his gaze intense. "But I didn't bring you here for that. I'm not offering you a job as my bodyguard. A bodyguard reacts. I need someone who acts first." He gestured to the city below. "My empire has 1,000 enemies, corporate rivals, political players, and men like Thorn. I fight them in boardrooms, but the rules are changing. I need a new department, one that operates in the gray spaces. Your department. You will build it from the ground up. You will answer only to me. Your mandate, neutralize threats before they even have a name. It was an offer of immense power, a kingdom of shadows. Aara met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She had spent 5 years running from her skills, and now she was being asked to build a throne upon them. "I accept," she said. "On 2 conditions." Croft's eyebrow arched in surprise. "First," Aara stated, her voice firm, "Robert Thorne is to be left alone. No retaliation from you or your company. The stalemate I created holds. He stays down, and you let him stay there." It was a bold demand, protecting his enemy. After a moment of thought, Croft gave a single, sharp nod. "Done." "Second," she continued, her voice dropping, "I keep the Phoenix Drive." She held up the tiny, feather-shaped device she had concealed since that night. "It doesn't belong to you or to him. It belongs to me. It's my leverage, Mr. Croft, to ensure the necessary actions your company takes don't cross a line I'm unwilling to defend." She was not asking to be his weapon, but to be his check and balance. For a long moment, the billionaire was silent, studying the woman before him. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a look of pure, unadulterated respect. He had expected a soldier, but he had found a strategist. "Welcome to Croft Enterprises, Ms. Vance." "Vance," he said, extending his hand. Aara took it. The clasp of their hands sealed a new contract, a silent agreement forged high above the bustling city lights. The waitress, a fleeting phantom, a forgotten narrative in a deserted restaurant, was gone. In her stead stood the director of his most clandestine operations, a queen reigning over a chessboard of her own design, perpetually guarding the precarious balance between protection and betrayal. And so, the tale of that rain-soaked night at the Gilded Spoon concludes. But the saga of Aarons, a name now etched in the annals of untold power, is only just beginning. This narrative serves as a potent reminder. Extraordinary strength often hides behind the most unremarkable facades, and our deepest wounds frequently become the wellspring of our greatest resilience. It's not a simplistic morality play of good versus evil, but rather a nuanced exploration of the intricate, messy, morally ambiguous terrain where true character is forged in the crucible of adversity. A billionaire, a benefactor, and the woman caught in the crosshairs. Who was truly in the right? What choices would you have made, wielding such immense power? The lines of morality are rarely as clear-cut as they initially appear. If this story of courage, conflict, and the genesis of a new kind of power resonated with you, please show your support by hitting the like button. Share this video with a friend who appreciates stories imbued with genuine depth and unexpected plot twists. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. We have many more compelling narratives to share, tales that delve beyond the superficial headlines to explore the incredible, multifaceted complexities of the human spirit. Your support is instrumental in making this all possible. Thank you for listening.